Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today, we're going to start talking about the reasons that you took this course, actually. We're going to start talking about us. And we've learned all of this information about genes, DNA, genes, chromosomes, mutations, all of these things. And the reason that we have done that is so that we can start placing ourselves in the world and among all of the other animals. Where are we? Where do we come from? Where did we go? How did we get where we are today? And so that's what we're going to start talking about. And in this section, what I want to talk about is our origins. Okay, so there are a couple of theories of human origins or human evolution, but the two big ones that are the ones that have the most support are going to be the multi-regional continuity model, sometimes called multi-regionalism, and out of Africa 2, also called the replacement model. Now, originally there was an out of Africa 1, which just talked about one migration, but that has since been turned over, and we now look at this as a series of double migrations. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so multi-regional continuity model. There are not as many proponents for this as there are for out of Africa 2, the replacement. But I do want to talk about it a little bit because there is some evidence that this may be true. There's more evidence for the out of Africa. But in this case, what we say is that modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, transition from Homo erectus across Africa and Eurasia. And because they were in constant contact among the populations, you've got trade and all these things, whatever's going on, you would have some interbreeding. And so humans would be linked by the gene flow and in every region. And so beneficial mutations that arose in one place would actually appear in lots of places. But you might have populations. So if you have a population in Africa versus a population in Asia, some of the genetic drift stuff may never make it across, but things that would help for survival would get transmitted along those lines. That doesn't actually seem that likely, okay? And so, because this would require lots and lots of migration, okay? And so people constantly on the move and interacting with each other. But if you have very small populations to begin with, and we did have very small populations, it seems unlikely that you would have enough contact to actually have this group. Now, the evidence, or this group sharing genes, and the other thing too is that Homo erectus actually existed in China for at least 100,000 years after the emergence of Homo sapiens sapiens. There's no changeover in that case. You have Homo erectus as Homo erectus coexisting with Homo sapiens. That's us coexisting with almost modern us, a little bit archaic, but anyway. The evidence for the multi-regional continuity model, proponents of this say that there is this continuity of the fossil record, and so you see these gradual changes from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens in all of these places, as opposed to some sort of, quote, abrupt shift around 200,000 years ago when you have the appearance of modern humans. Okay. Now, here's your first question. Which of the following would not be a reason that the record of human fossils may not support the multi-regional continuity model? Well, first, there would probably not be an abrupt shift in appearance even if humans migrated out of Africa. 200,000 years is a very short period of time on an evolutionary scale and would not show large changes even in isolated populations. Or both of these could be reasons that the record of human fossils may not support the multi-regional continuity model. Well, both of these things could actually be true, and they would not provide. That would mean that the fossil record does not provide evidence for the multi-regional continuity model. There's some genetic evidence, but it's shaky, right? And so we're actually not going to talk about it because what we want to focus on is out of Africa or the replacement model. And what this says is that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa from Homo erectus. Some small number of individuals migrated out. There were two waves of migration. You have the archaic Homo sapiens, and then you have, which is sometimes called Homo sapiens idaltu. But anyway, the second migration was the anatomical modern human, Homo sapien, modern us, Homo sapiens sapiens. And so we would have walked out of Africa and then populated Europe and Asia and all of these other places. Okay, So, what is the evidence for the out of Africa model, the out of Africa theory? There is actually some very significant genetic evidence, and this is why we've been talking about genes this whole time. There are two really big pieces, right? Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA. So we have a, quote, common mother that's called Eve, and so she's sometimes referred to as the mitochondrial Eve. Mitochondrial DNA, when you look at indigenous peoples worldwide, okay, and you compare that to ancestral DNA, you see these common sequences that will eventually coalesce back to one woman about 150,000 years ago, okay? And another support for this is that African populations show more genetic diversity among themselves than all of the rest of the human genotypes, which means that the African populations have existed longer than the other populations, okay? Now, this is only going to talk about DNA that is passed matrilineally. So you've got maternal DNA in the mitochondria going to the child, you know, and so that's through the mother's line. But what about the male line? This would be the Y chromosome. All males have a Y chromosome. It is passed from father to son and so on. And there is a gene on it called the ZFY gene. And that shows, it's been analyzed much like the mitochondrial DNA, and it shows a common, quote, father, right, or the Y chromosomal atom from about 200,000 years ago. And some of the mitochondrial Eve evidence can actually go back a little bit farther to about 170,000 years or so. And so you've got this agreement genetically, right? And when you start looking at the HLA immune genetic complex, it shows that the human population has actually never sunk down below about 50,000, although some would argue that it's been as low as 10,000, but that's, you know, neither here nor there. So we've always maintained this small population, but it hasn't necessarily been connected, right? Now, it is important to remember that while this is all true, the mitochondrial Eve and the Y chromosomal atom, it's important to remember that humans, our genetic makeup comes from lots of individuals over many, many generations, even though the mitochondrial DNA and the ZFY, I never finished that sentence, chromosome can be tracked back. There are contributions from lots and lots of people. And I put this in here, by the way, just to show you, nuclear DNA is going to be inherited from all of your ancestors, okay? Whereas mitochondrial DNA is going to go solely down the female line. So I just put that picture so you can understand that. Now here's your next question. Eve was the only modern woman living at the time, which is why she was our common relative. True or false? That is totally false, right? It just so happens that all of the women who ever lived outside of that line simply did not have offspring that went on to reproduce continually. So there were probably lots of women. It's just that their lines died out at some point, okay? And so we all go back to this one woman. All right, now, and then there's all kinds of other things. You'll hear about the 7 daughters of Eve, which are the European populations, and then there are, I think 4 different populations for the Native Americans, maybe. I think 9 for the Japanese population, something like that. So there are all these, quote, daughters of Eve that you can track various populations that are in existence now to these women, but all of those women backtrack to Eve. So we're just going to focus on the mitochondrial Eve portion of that. Now, when you start looking at migration, here we start, actually in East Africa. You should look over here. We've got East Africa. The yellow is going to be Eve. The blue is going to be Adam. And you can see how you have these populations. You can track the genes among the populations, and you can actually see where all of these individuals, how this population spread. And that's really very cool, okay? And I like this map. I like this map because it's got both mitochondrial and Y chromosomal DNA. And then I like this one, even though it's only mitochondrial, it actually shows the times, right? And so we leave Africa somewhere between 55,000 and 75,000 years ago. We are in Asia as early as 70,000 years ago. We're in Australia as early as 60,000 years ago. Europe, 50,000 years ago. The Americas, well, it depends. There's some argument about that. We'll talk about that later on. And so then we start populating islands and stuff like that. So anyway, interesting stuff. And this is all done through genetics. Now I do want to show you an animation at this point, so we are going to shift over to a website. Okay, so this website is pretty cool. It's The Journey of Mankind presented by the Bradshaw Foundation, and I just want to have this going for you. Right, and so this just going to show, we start out with our mitochondrial DNA, here's our origins, and our Y chromosomal DNA, and then we start moving. And we actually move all over Africa first. Then and so here's, you can pause this at any time and read these, but I'm just going to go straight through it. And so then we spread out, we move into the Middle East, Northern Africa and the Middle East. And you can see along here, you've got that timeline. Now, we're actually exiting the area, right, Africa, but that branch dies out. And so that would have been the first migration, okay? And then actually, you've got this area becomes occupied by Neanderthal, which we'll talk about later on too. All right, now for the second migration, you can see kind of go in the same places, right? Except now, this time we go farther south. We stay south, partly because of that freeze issue that you can read about on those little notes later. And look, we follow along the ocean, the coast. Coasts are great places to go because it provides a wonderful source of food, and there's usually fresh water somewhere that's running to the ocean, rivers, stuff like that. And so there we go. We just keep on moving. Right. Oh, catastrophe. Okay. And so in this case, we actually have this big population crash, and we get an isolation between these two populations, and that's kind of interesting. This is, by the way, the prediction of that less than 10,000 adults. Okay, so then that clears up, and we, as humans, start on the move again, and we continue on. And so bad things happen. Oh, look, then we meet up again. It's very exciting. And so this is how these maps came about, by the way, and I like this just because it's a nice animation and you can see various things. You can read these. Again, you can pause it and read little notes. I think they're pretty cool. So we're moving on. Oh, look, there we're in Europe. Hello, Neanderthal man. We're hanging out with Neanderthal. They'll come up in just a second. Ooh, and then we start spreading out. We start going north, right? We keep moving farther west, right? And east, also east, this would be the east part. So we're moving west, we're moving north, we're moving east. And eventually we're going to come over here and we're going to populate, okay, we're going to populate the New World, right, North America and South America. And we'll talk about the multiple ways people may have been able to come in to the quote, New World. Okay, and the Bering Land Bridge is something you've probably heard of, but we'll talk about that more later on too. Okay, and look, there we go. Yay. Oh, look, everybody who was above this line dies out in the last ice age, so we are all south of that. So that kind of isolates populations as well. One of the things that I want to show you about this is the isolation of populations, and this is how we get those we get that genetic drift that we'll continue talking about when we start talking about selection and stuff like that. All right, we're almost done. Here we are, traveling. Oh, we're going farther south. Yay, us. Okay. That was about the last glaciation event. And so we're approaching, we're spreading out everywhere. So we've got all of these probably hunter-gatherer societies. Well, not probably, they are hunter-gatherer societies. But very soon now, we're going to reach the point around 10,000 years ago that we are domesticating animals, we are domesticating plants, okay? And so that will begin a new age for us. Right now, we are wanderers. We are getting our food on the move. We are on the move, you know, and so we're not going to settle down until right about now or so. And then a couple of thousand years later, we're going to start to see cities and stuff like that, okay? Okay, so anyway, here we're moving. Oh, look. And now we're going farther north now because the ice has receded. Yay. Okay, and then we're actually going to stop right here because I think that gets us to everywhere we want to go. So we will return to the PowerPoint. Okay, fun map. Yay. All right, so now moving on. it turns out we're not the only ones that left. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Homo erectus being in Asia 100,000 years, right? And so it turns out that Homo erectus also left. So out of Africa has actually occurred several times. Homo erectus leaves, right, is out, okay? And they're actually spreading out around the world. I mean, you're talking about, this is 160,000 years ago here, right? You're talking about the range of Neanderthal here being, well, Neanderthals over here. So there's several people. So let's stick with erectus. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So erectus leaves almost 2 million years ago, right? And so for 2 million years, you've had humans wandering this portion of the world. At some point, right, around 130,000 years ago or so, and actually they've been around a lot longer than this, but their range, Neanderthal, they've evolved from Homo erectus as well. And so this is their range, and this is all way before we actually get any of these places. So out of Africa has happened several times. Homo erectus left, Neanderthal evolved outside of Africa, and Homo sapiens left Africa. Okay, so last question. Which one of our contemporary relatives would be most likely to interbreed with us? Homo erectus, we know that we were in Asia together in the Middle East. Homo neanderthalensis, that is Neanderthal man, we know that we were in Europe in the Middle East with them, and then mostly Europe. And then Homo floresiensis, who we were contemporary with in Indonesia. So which one of these species would we have been most likely to interbreed? Well, it turns out DNA shows Neanderthal. Each one of us who is non-African will have somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, right? And that's kind of fun. So there was some interbreeding. It turns out that there's some evidence that shows that individuals that were interbreeding with Neanderthal, we are genetically different. We can interbreed apparently, and obviously we did, but there's something that suggests that the offspring of these unions would have been less fit. And so you don't have a lot of persistence in terms of that mixing. And so little bitty bit, right? 1 to 4%. But, you know, we're definitely not Neanderthals. They're definitely not us. And here's just a fun fact to close with. Red hair. Everybody's had red hair. Red hair seems to have arisen independently in both Neanderthals and modern humans. And this is what your red hair Neanderthal might have looked like. Okay. And by the way, this is why you have the Neanderthal DNA in the non-African populations. That interbreeding rather occurs right after we leave, when we hit the Middle East. And so these populations, right after this, would have had that interaction. Okay, so that is it for our first migration, and I will see you next time in class. If you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for listening.